This video is meant to be a fairly concise overview of experiments. What do they look like? Why do we run them? And how to structure good ones. Now, it builds upon the material in my most recent book, Testing with Humans, all about experiments, how you run experiments to de-risk ideas, which in turn was a sequel to the award-winning book, Talking to Humans, which is about getting out of the building and actually talking to your customers and to your market. So let's start with a couple high-level concepts. The basic notion of lean startup, or if you want to call it sort of de-risking ideas so that you can be more successful, I think is accomplished pretty well in this visualization. The old approach of business was what we in the software business call waterfall, where you come up with an idea, you sort of pitch it, you build a business model around it, you design it, you build it, you produce it, you sell it, and you ship it. By the time you get into market, you've invested a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of time. Chances are you've got something wrong. Might be something little, might be something big, but those mistakes are very expensive if you wait all the way to that point. Now, a better approach for ideas that have uncertainty, and all new ideas have uncertainty, is to be paying down risk as you go. And so that's the green line. That's sort of the lean startup concept, where you examine the risks that you have and you try to resolve them early on. You try to figure out which ones are real, which ones do I need to actually handle or make changes and adjust what I'm doing to be able to solve, and which things are fine and full speed ahead. So instead of sort of just assuming that you're right and building up a lot of risk over time, you ask hard questions as you go and make better decisions as you go. Now, there's two ways to do this. You start with your vision. You start with the goal, what you're trying to achieve for your customer and for yourself. And that vision and that goal is going to have a business model. It's going to have a whole bunch of assumptions around what you're trying to solve, who you're solving it for, how you're going to be creating value for both your customer and yourself, etc. How you're going to get those customers. Now, some of those assumptions are going to be risky and some are going to be quite confident. There's two ways to tackle the risky ones. You can get out of the building and interview people, what we call customer discovery. And you can observe their behavior, you can talk to them about what they've done in the past, how they've tried to solve the problem, whether they've spent money on the problem before, what went into that buying process, all these kinds of questions you can get from talking to people. But you also want to complement that by watching what people do, and that's where experiments come in. Experiments are basically a structured test that you can run to watch people's behavior. You want to do these two things side by side. They're actually mutually reinforcing, and they will provide different kinds of insights. But essentially, you begin with that vision, and then you take these two approaches to de-risk and ultimately make better, smarter, faster decisions as you're going along. So let's talk about a few examples of experiments. Now, this is split on the two sides of the screen, one long landing page from Cooking Light magazine. We were working with them and helped them come up with this concept of a meal plan subscription service. They have this huge library of recipes, and the notion was, what about people who love to cook but want to actually maintain their weight or even lose weight? There wasn't a lot that served that particular population within the weight loss and the diet space. So this was a new potential revenue stream utilizing existing assets that they have. Now, we ran a whole bunch of different kinds of experiments for them around this idea because it sounded good, but we needed to test whether it was good. One of the first things we did was spend a day and we created a very simple landing page. And it spelled out the value proposition and it asked people to sign up for a paid trial. And we ABC tested 3 different price points, and we tracked the conversion rates. We drove traffic to it using a few different methods, and we tracked the conversion rates, paying attention to both the price point and also what method we had used to drive consumers towards this page. But it was a simple smoke test to be able to see, okay, we think this idea is interesting. Does the market think that it's interesting? Now, a slightly more elevated version of this is where you actually put an order form in place. Now, Tuft & Needle, which is a startup that sells mattresses online, and they just sold, I think, for about $300 million, they did a variation of a landing page where they actually put in a credit card processing order form because they wanted to really see were people serious. Now, it's one thing to ask people to give you an email or even sign up for a trial, but you have to take that data with a grain of salt. Now, asking people to give you money, that's pretty serious. If someone's willing to give you their credit card, that's setting the bar pretty high. And that's what you want to do as you're running these experiments. You're trying to get a sense of how seriously does someone actually want what you've got to offer. So Tuft & Needle put a credit card processing form on their landing page before they'd even really gotten their startup going, just to see whether people would buy mattresses on the web. What they did, though, that was interesting is they broke the order form. They didn't want to have to deal with security issues and keeping credit cards. So they didn't actually let the transaction go through, but they collected the information and followed up with people afterwards. It was an interesting hack. So let's talk about a few other lightweight ways to run experiments. Now, a lot of people who have digital properties come up with interesting ideas or have their customers request interesting ideas. PBS, as a website, had a lot of their customers, a lot of their visitors, were saying there's a lot on this website, it's complicated, can't you personalize it for me? Like, take my interests and give me a personalized version so that I can know which shows I should watch and where to go on the website. They had enough people asking for this that they took it seriously. But rather than assuming that what people were asking for was actually what they would do, what they did is they created what we call a door-to-nowhere test. They put buttons on the web page, on several web pages actually, that sort of dangled this feature, said, personalize your PBS experience. And they measured whether or not people clicked it. People did not click it. And so that led them to believe that the feature, while people thought they wanted it, they didn't want it enough to actually put in a little work and do the action. So Dropbox is another one that tested their ideas early with a fairly lightweight approach. What they did is they created a marketing material, a promotional video. And this is before they actually had built their product. Because at that point in time, it's hard to remember now, but at that point in time, people told them that the concept of cloud storage was solved, it was done, and this is before Google Drive, this is before Apple iCloud. All those things didn't exist at that point in time, but people thought this market was solved and done, but they did not. The founders of Dropbox thought it was still a problem, it was still too hard, so they created a video. And it was a really lightweight sort of video using, as you could see from the image, they have cutouts of paper and you could see someone's finger over it. It was sort of lightweight and it had a little bit of humor to it, but it got their vision across. And they watched this video go viral, helping them believe, giving them confidence that the actual interest in what they were trying to make was pretty strong. Now, you have to also, when it comes to these sort of viral videos, you have to take the results with a grain of salt. What goes viral versus what people will pay for can be different, but it still gives you a signal. The last thing I'll say about videos like this, or any kind of marketing promotional material you might do, is that the fidelity of the work that you do, how glossy it is, let me put it that way, depends on the space that you're in. So Dropbox can do this kind of humorous, paper cutout approach, because they were going for a fairly technical audience. It was a geeky audience that would appreciate that lo-fi look. If you're a fashion startup, for example, you could possibly do that if you're very clever, but that marketplace tends to appreciate a little more polish. So just think about the level of polish that you need and tune it to your particular market. Don't do more work than you need to do, but do just enough. Now, taking prototypes to the next level. Mayo Clinic had a division, they have an education division, and one of their goals was to make it easier for doctors and NPs and PAs, those are nurse practitioners, physician assistants, to be able to stay on top of advances in the field of medicine and and sort of just absorb information and be able to make better decisions. So we worked with them and we tried a whole bunch of different ideas, running experiments to see which ones felt viable, both from a sort of user learning and user interest perspective, but also from a business validation perspective. Now, one of the ideas was a game that allowed people to uncover these cards that sort of fed them information, and then they'd have to solve a particular case around a patient. And we came up with this idea, and by the afternoon, we were paper prototyping the actual game to see how people interacted with the concept, to see whether people thought it was fun, to see whether people were grokking the concepts that we were trying to get across. So what you're seeing on the image is the actual version of this game. We always knew that we were going to create a digital version of it if it passed all the experiments, but we didn't want to start there because that was expensive and a lot of work. We were able to, using index cards and some laser printouts and some 11 by 17 sheets of paper and magic markers, we were able to create this game in about an hour. And then we went out to the cafeteria at Mayo Clinic and we had some doctors and NPs play it, and the results were great. So the game industry has long used paper prototyping as a way to put their ideas to the test really, really early on. And it's interesting for you to think about how could you hack a very crude version but effective version of your product experience to see how people react to it. Now this is testing more product, while other things will be testing your business model. Speaking of customer experience, you could also test things early on with physical prototypes, and there's lots of different ways to do it. I'll talk in a few minutes about faking it, but the Apple Store, before Apple broke ground in any cities for their Apple Store, they built a replica of their Apple Store. And that allowed them to watch how people navigated the store, how people interacted with the products. Now, I remember many years ago, before Starwood Hotels built the very first Aloft hotel, I went and I was working with them and I saw them, they had built out an entire version of their lobby so they could actually test out their ideas and to see how people flowed in the space. Some people will build, with 3D printing, they'll build physical versions of their product, or even if 3D printing isn't an option, they'll try to create a single version of a physical product. Now, sometimes you can build that first prototype inexpensively. Sometimes it's actually more expensive, but it's okay if that first version of your product is more expensive if you're going to learn from it and it's going to save you money and save from costly errors before you scale up into mass production. Now, what are some ways to test your business model? Well, one of the classic ways that people have been doing for a long, long time is just trying to sell ahead of time. This could be a paid pilot. This could be trying to get some prepaid LOIs. Could be crowdfunding. That's sort of the newest variation. And so if you're in the B2B space, this could be as simple as actually saying, okay, I'm going to target 10, 20, 30 customers, and I'm going to see if I can actually get 50% of them or 60% of them or whatever bar you set for yourself to pay me ahead of time, to sign up for a paid pilot, even if you give them a discount as an early customer, but just to put some money down. A little softer than that might be to give you to sort of sign a letter of intent around your product. But the more you get people to commit money, the more serious they are. And that's where crowdfunding can be interesting. That tends to play a little bit better towards the consumer space, but websites like Kickstarter and Indiegogo really allow you to test the viability of an idea and to sort of pre-sell your product before you've actually fully finished it. Now, a couple minutes ago I referred to faking a hardware product. The reason why we're looking at someone shooting a basketball, it's one of my favorite examples. It came from Mike Blackwell over in Ohio. He was working with a team and they had sort of wrapped their head around this idea of instrumenting a basketball, putting sensors inside the basketball so that you could deliver reports to professional athletes or college athletes about how they were dribbling and how they were shooting. And he had the insight to say, whoa, you guys are getting lost in the engineering of your product, which I know is a fun place to be, but what about the business here? Are you actually solving a problem, and is what your product is going to create actually going to entice your customers so that they become and stay customers? So what he had them do is take a regular old basketball, hand it to people, and tell them it was the basketball with sensors in it. And they went and they played with the basketball, and then they handed them some reports. And they had created some reports that would be directionally correct for the person that was shooting and dribbling. And then they got to see whether people really found that data useful, whether people would pay for the data. If my recollection is correct, I think they decided that their idea wasn't ready for the market. Regardless of the engineering of the product, the business and the market interest wasn't there, and so they had to rethink their concept. Another version of a Wizard of Oz prototype where you fake, the reason why it's called Wizard of Oz, as you probably started to figure out, is that you fake a real product. The customer thinks they're interacting with a real product, but actually behind the scenes, it's a lot of manual labor, or in the case of a basketball, a fake basketball. So what we did with the Taproot Foundation, which is a nonprofit that connects nonprofits who need help with professionals who are willing to give them pro bono support. Think about a lawyer willing to give a nonprofit some assistance on a case, or an ad agency building a website for a nonprofit. So Taproot's been around for a long time, manually connecting the two sides, but they wanted to do this for more people. They wanted to help more people and scale up their mission. And they thought they could do this with an online marketplace. But they were smart. Even though they had been doing this for a long time, even though theoretically they were experts in what they were doing, they knew that because this was going to be a new customer experience, they didn't know everything. They wanted to call into question their assumptions. So one of the first things we did was create a Wizard of Oz, where there was a website that was built, but we built it very fast in just a couple days because the entire back end was fake. So someone would click a button to express their interest, but it didn't really do much in the back end. It gave us just enough information about who was doing that we can then manually sort of connect the two sides. So it's a veneer. You're creating a veneer, but behind the scenes, it's all human beings as hamsters on the wheel. That allowed them to learn a huge amount about some of the gaps in the product experience and some things they were taking for granted when they were providing the service manually that they weren't going to be able to deliver as part of the online product. And it made them really rethink what the customer experience was going to be. And that allowed the final product, which you can find at Taproot Plus, to be much more effective. So that was done very inexpensively, very quickly, in just a few weeks, as opposed to the months it takes to build a robust product. The last example that I'm going to end with here is a concierge experiment. And this is where, instead of hiding your manual labor behind a veneer, behind a fake product, you actually just deliver the service very overtly. So Rent the Runway is a successful startup in New York, and what they do now is it's an online service where people can rent fashion. So instead of having to buy expensive clothes just to wear one or two times, they could rent it, get it back, and get something new. But at the beginning, they didn't know if that was a good idea. So they offered themselves out as a personalized fashion service, allowing people to rent, but like manually going out there and delivering the service and being with the customer. And this is a classic way for people that are trying to figure out if their customer experience, if their product idea is going to be worthwhile. Oftentimes, you can deliver it manually at the beginning. Just offer the service and see whether interest is there. I remember talking to an entrepreneur who wanted to build a marketplace connecting two sides of the steel industry. And the best way to start there was to actually just begin by manually matchmaking the two sides, really understanding the needs of the two sides, and then the product that could be created. Both the business would be validated, you could see whether people would pay for it, and then the product that you would ultimately create would be much, much smarter. Now, there's a lot more ideas about and variations of experiments. Just getting people to complete a task and then measuring whether they do so can be a really interesting way to run an experiment. These are a few variations of them, but it really the possibilities are endless. It's all where your creativity goes. So let's talk about a few high-level tactics here. Now, we talked about a number of different experiment sort of archetypes a second ago. I like to present this graph, I call this the truth curve, because what's really important to me is how you interpret the data. We don't run experiments for experiment's sake. We run it because we want to make better decisions. You can't make good decisions unless you're interpreting the data well. It needs to be a good experiment, it needs to be believable, but you also have to interpret it well. And depending on the experiment, the believability of what you're learning is going to vary. It does tend to loosely correlate with the level of work that goes into the experiment. So let's explain this graph. On the far right, you have a live product in the market. You can see whether it's selling, you can see whether people are buying, whether they're churning, whether they like your business, whether they don't like your business. There's data there, there's proof, there's truth. You can trust that truth, but you don't want to wait to that point in time. As we talked about before, if you wait until you're at live product, live business, you've built up a lot of risk, and now the mistakes that you've made become very costly. So you really want to start on the left side of this chart and figure out where you want to play based on your context in the middle as you move from left to right. You don't have to do everything, you choose where you play. But the key thing is being aware that you have to sort of adjust for the believability of information depending on the tactic. So on the far left, in red, you have Fantasyland. That's you and your idea, and you're in the conference room, you're talking to your colleagues or your co-founders, and everything, like, reality is not hit yet, right? Everything's fantastic. That's an exciting time to be. It's a fun place to be. But you need to get some truth, some reality checking in there. So what can you do? Well, you can get out of the building and start talking to your customers in 20 minutes, in an hour. Now, it depends on how hard it is to get to your customers, but I guarantee if you wanted to get to one of your customers today, you can do so if you set your mind to it. So you can get out of the building, you can talk to people very quickly. However, and that's what the book Talking to Humans is all about. But what people say and what they do don't always correlate, right? People are not always fully aware of their own goals. They have faulty memories even of their own behavior in past. And I always try to avoid speculation, but speculation is very dangerous territory. So you have to use a lot of judgment. You have to take what you hear with a grain of salt, which is why we balance experiments with qualitative research. Paper testing an idea is an interesting way of just getting ideas out there. Those marketing promotional materials that we talked about can be interesting. But as I mentioned before, you have to take what you're seeing, you have to take the data of how successful your experiment is going with a bit of a grain of salt. Concierge and Wizard of Oz experiments, because they're more experiential, they're a little bit more robust, they're a little bit bigger, I think are more believable. And so you can trust what you're seeing there a little bit more. Still not the same thing as live product, but very, very useful and worth doing. So just keep this in mind. As you're designing your experiment, think about where it sits on this curve generally. And doesn't mean one's better than the other. It simply means you have to think about how much judgment you apply to the data that's coming in. The next concept I wanted to get across is the experiment loop. This is basically, it's just a set of cyclical processes that you go through. The first is that you treat your ideas not as facts, but as hypotheses, or if you want to frame it, as assumptions. The next thing you have to do, you break out those assumptions across your entire business model, not just about your product, not just about who your customer is, but also about how you're going to help make things valuable for them and make money or whatever sort of value you're trying to derive for yourself. So you got to think about across your entire business model. Then you've got to prioritize the risky ones. What I mean by that is that some assumptions you're going to have high confidence in, and some you might be a little nervous about. They're uncertain. Some assumptions are going to have a big impact on your business if you're wrong, and some won't have impact at all if you're wrong. You don't want to pay attention to the things you're really confident in, and you don't need to pay attention to the things that will not have any impact on your business. What matters are the assumptions, the risks that feel like they could have a dangerous level of impact and where there's a dangerous level of uncertainty. Hopefully that makes sense to you all. So once you've got that, then you know where to focus your efforts, both in terms of getting out of the building and talking to people, but also running experiments. So then what you want to do is design compact, efficient, believable experiments that are structured but can be run very quickly, that you can then get going. What I tend to find is that people, when they start doing experiments, their first experiments are 3 to 5 months long, then they manage to get it down to 3 weeks, and then they can get it down to 3 days. The more you can compress that learning curve so you can run faster experiments earlier in your journey along this way, the better. But everyone sort of has their own learning curve. Now, the experiments that you choose to do in terms of making them believable also depend on your context. And so you just got to be thoughtful. If you have 2 assumptions that you're worried about, and one of them you can get out of the building and run experiments faster and get data sooner, choose that one. Just get some external data flowing into your heads, flowing into your decision-making process as soon as possible. So, if in doubt between a big thing and a fast thing, start with the fast thing, okay? So, you run your experiment, and then, of course, the most important thing is to use your judgment with what you're learning, make decisions, and go. And then rinse, repeat. So, how do you generate experiment ideas? Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but a really effective way to generate a lot of experiment ideas and then choose the best ones, I find, takes this idea from the design community called a design studio or a charrette. And you basically take a piece of paper like you see here. I like using 11 by 17. You fold it into 6 boxes, and you give your team 4 minutes, and you choose your risky assumption, and you write that at the top of the piece of the paper, and you say, okay, you've got 4 minutes, I want a different experiment that you can run in each one of those boxes. Give them 4 minutes, and maybe if people need it, give them another 1 or 2 minutes. But keep the pace up so that no one gets too bogged down in one particular idea. Now, you can give them a few prompts to make this even better. Tell them, what can you do that would take 1 day? What can you do that could take 1 week? What could you do that would take 1 month? Tell them to think about things that they can create that don't require you to build the product. How can you think like a hacker? How can you fake your way through this? How can you take shortcuts? Because remember, what the goal is here is to learn and make good decisions, not to build the product or build the business. It's to make decisions that will lead to a better business. So run this fast-paced sort of design sketching exercise, shake things up. Once you've got a whole bunch of ideas, you can pick some of the best ones across the team, and then you want to actually flesh it out and define it carefully. And this is an experiment template that I found useful, and it asks 8 different questions. First, what's the hypothesis that you want to prove or disprove? Don't have more than 2 or 3. If you can have 1, that's ideal. Don't go more than 2 or 3. Now, related to that hypothesis, there should be a quantifiable pass-fail metric that you're shooting for, i.e., why is this experiment successful? When does it succeed? When does it fail? So I gave that example before of saying I'm going to go out and I'm going to pre-sell a particular product and saying, okay, I'm going to go to, let's say, 20 different potential customers, and I want to get 60% of them to sign up for the paid pilot. Or it might be that I say it's actually more realistic as 20 to 30%. Now here's the thing. Everyone stresses out about what number to pick, but don't have that stop you from picking a number. Look outside yourself, look into best practices, try to like be sensible as to what good might be. You know, if you're doing an online landing page, for example, you know, you could assume that if most sort of online services, e-commerce services, people convert at anywhere between 1 to 4%, well, you want to set the bar higher, maybe set it at 10 to 15%, because you're really testing for demand. But you can ground yourself in some external metrics that you could see, right, and that you could learn from. But one thing to think about is don't sandbag yourself either. It's better to set a slightly more aggressive bar and shoot for it than to sort of sandbag and just sort of guarantee the success of the experiment by setting a low number. Remember, Whether the experiment succeeds or fails is not the point. Making smarter business decisions is. If people don't create a metric going into things, not only does the experiment tend to be mushy, but guess what happens? It always succeeds, right? Because we can always rationalize what happens after the fact. So setting that number actually provides sort of a backbone to the experiment that's really useful. The next thing you need to do in the template is figure out who you are targeting. Now this matters a great deal. You need to think about your risky assumption and decide who is the relevant customer, whether that's a company or a person, to go after that will make the data that you're receiving from your experiment believable. Now, if your product and your business is aiming at teenage girls, you wouldn't go try to recruit grandmothers and vice versa. Right? If you're thinking about your early adopter industry is going to be healthcare, you won't go into the manufacturing industry, for example. So be smart about where you choose. Now, once you have intent around who you need to involve, you need to go get them. So you've got to spend a little bit of time thinking about how you acquire those participants. That can be a very stressful thing for some teams, but there's always a way. If your team is missing that sort of sales and marketing minded person who knows how to get out and sort of grab attention and get to people, then pull that person onto the team. But there's a lot of different ways to do this. If you're in the B2B space, sometimes going to conferences or meetups is an interesting way to do it. Sometimes just cold calling and reaching out is effective. There's online methods, there's using newsletters, there's even paid acquisition. So there's more in the book about this topic. It's a big topic and it's something people stress about, but don't let this stop you, right? If your business is going to be successful, you have to be able to get customers. If you can't even get people to your experiment, how do you think you're going to succeed, right? So don't let this stop you. It's really important. Next, how are you going to run the experiment? Now, for this part of the template, just try to write out a few sentences that lay out the skeleton of what this is going to be, and then lay out how long you want it to take. Be aggressive about how long it's going to take. Lastly, think about the qualitative things you want to learn as you run this experiment. So, as you're putting people through the experiment, you want to create opportunities to pull people aside and talk to them, to ask them questions, to understand what's going on behind their behavior. That will often sort of give you these soft but very deep insights as to motivation and what's going on. So as you're going into the experiment, write down a few things that you'd like to learn that are on the softer, more qualitative side. So you've done an experiment sketching exercise, you've laid out a whole bunch of ideas, now you've taken a couple of those experiments and you really define them out. And of course you need to run them. So what are a few attributes of good experiments? How can you figure out what is a good experiment versus a weak one? Well, they tend to have a few things in common. One, they're structured. They're not loosey-goosey. You're not flying by the seat of your pants. And you don't have too many variables going on. They're focused. You're trying to sort of ask one hard question. You have one or two hypotheses you're really testing. And what you don't want to be doing is changing a ton of things all at the same time, because then it gets really hard to interpret the data that's coming in. You have too many moving parts. So make things focused, be focused on your hypotheses, be focused on how they work, be focused in terms of how you change things. That will help make it believable. But you also need to sort of come into your experiment asking yourself, how can I make this more believable? What is an adequate level of hackiness that will give us speed, but not so much that it actually defeats the whole purpose? Now, this is a tricky area that requires judgment. For some designers and engineers that are used to building really careful, robust, elegant products, what they think of as believable and the form factor is probably higher than is necessary. At the same time, people can go wrong where they just get too fast and loose and they shoot themselves in the foot. So there's no right answer here. You have to find your middle ground. The right form factor could be done in a day, it could be done in 2 weeks, it could be done in 3 weeks. You need to think about it, but really use your judgment and use your critical eye here. But think about how it can be both hacky and fast, but believable. Now, I talked about not having too many moving parts, but keeping an experiment flexible can be useful. What I often find, especially for the bigger ones, is that I'll go into an experiment and very quickly learn that I probably should tweak something in the experiment. That maybe we need to change who we invited in, or maybe we need to change how we onboard them, or some element of the experience or the structure of the experiment. That's okay. It's okay. Just don't change too many things at once, right? Change a dial and then change another dial. Watch what happens. Change a dial. Watch what happens, that kind of thing. So it's okay to be flexible, but don't have too many changing parts. One way to get ahead of this is to actually run an experiment on your experiment. So if I'm doing a Wizard of Oz or Concierge experiment, I'll often just do a trial run with 1 or 2 people just to see whether or not the structure of the experiment is as thought through as it should be. Chances are, almost always, I learn something that then I adjust for the next experiment. The same approach can be done by putting different cohorts through your experiments, not all at once. So let's say you wanted to go after 200 people. Instead of going after all 200 all at once, you might break them into groups of 25 or 50 and put them through in chunks, and that allows you to iterate the experiments. You do version A on one group, the first say 50, and then you change something about it. You do it on the next 50. And then you change something and do it on the next one. So you can learn as you go, and by not using all of your recruited sort of participants, all 200 at once, that gives you room to get smarter, okay? So lastly, you need to keep things compact. Try to make things as small as possible because time disappears like you cannot believe when you're running experiments. Now, it can be hard enough getting the powers that be to allow you to do this in the first place because people tend to think that experiments feel like you're slowing down, but they actually don't slow you down. They allow you to make better, faster decisions. But it's in your interest to keep them as compact as possible. So, a question that I'm constantly asking regarding that is this one. How can I learn just as much, if not more, in half the time and half the effort? And what I find is that when I design an experiment, and I'm supposed to be good at this stuff, I'll design an experiment and I'll ask this question, and indeed, I will make it smaller. And then I'll look at that design and I'll ask the question again, how can I learn twice as much, if not more, with half the time and half the effort? And chances are, I could make it smaller again. And one of the key ways to unlock this is not trying to design your experiment for everyone and for everything. Figure out how you can narrow down the customer target that you're going after. How can you hack the experience or your product a little bit more? How can you speed things up? How can you put learning first rather than scaling your business or delivering your product? It's all about learning and better decisions. So think about those shortcuts. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me by email or on Twitter, or you can reach out to my colleague on the book, Frank Rubalowski at New York University's Entrepreneurship Center. And you can see his Twitter handle and his email there. I hope this video has been useful for you. Good luck with what you're trying to do. Good luck trying to put these ideas into practice. Remember, it's all about action and decisions and being smart with this stuff. Reach out to us if you have any questions, and good luck.